Bob Woodard, Chairman, Dare County Board of Commissioners. I was fortunate to attend the presentation by Peg Howe on seismic testing and offshore drilling recently. I encourage you all to dig into it, look at it, and understand just what seismic testing and offshore drilling is off our coast. And I'd just like to also reiterate that our Board of Commissioners and prior Board of Commissioners, we have passed numerous resolutions. We just did a recent resolution once again to send to our legislators in opposition to offshore drilling and seismic testing. And we cannot, under any circumstance, jeopardize a $1.2 billion tourism industry in Dare County if we were to ever have a spill off our coast.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you so many folks for showing up tonight. You never know how these things are going to go. We're always prepared for whatever happens, and it's always exciting speaking to a standing room only crowd. And if any of you can find seats, you don't have to stand the whole time. There are a couple chairs here and there. Find your way to a chair. So as Randy mentioned, he and I met each other 4 years ago in Wilmington. I came to this fight as a concerned citizen, as probably all of you are, because I started just after dinosaurs roamed the earth. I started as the first woman drilling engineer in the Gulf of Mexico. That's when I was young and energetic. It was so long ago that the title for the job was company man, and it has stayed that way for quite a while. This was my first rig. Some people get pictures of their first car. I got a picture of my first rig, Penrod 60. I worked in the Gulf of Mexico and in the North Sea a bit, and then I also worked in the Netherlands on some onshore rigs. So I had heard when my husband and I moved to South Carolina in our so-called retirement about a dozen years ago, and I was reading our local paper in the fall of 2014, and one of the then county councilmen wrote this letter on the op-ed page saying he had been to this meeting in Myrtle Beach, which is a little ways up the road from us, and he heard all about the wondrous opportunity that was coming to our coast from the oil and gas industry. They made a presentation that he just thought was awesome. They were going to bring money, they were going to bring jobs. This was going to be the solution for all of South Carolina's problems. And the minute I read that article, my heart sunk, because I realized we had moved somewhere that was in a bullseye for offshore oil and gas drilling. That was 4 years ago. I didn't know a tenth of what I know now about what it takes to fight a fight. I've never been an advocate or been on the front lines like this before, but we've all learned what we've needed to learn to be able to keep our coast safe. And so what several of us did right off the bat was put together a citizens group that we named SODA, Stop Offshore Drilling in the Atlantic. We aren't a 501c3 or anything fancy. We're just a group of people who have been getting together every other week for 4 years, planning events, speaking to people all up and down the coast, speaking to people across the country, across the state, up into DC, down to Atlanta, with one single mission, and that is to stop offshore oil and gas drilling and seismic airgun blasting. We're not an environmental group, and we don't have all those kinds of things to worry about that everybody else has to worry about with those broader missions. We are solely focused on this one fight, and that's been a luxury to be able to focus on these one things. And there's only two things that we do. We educate and we advocate. So our job, mine primarily, has been to let people understand what happens when the oil business comes to town and what it's going to do to our coast permanently. And then all the other folks that I've been working with have taught me how to be an advocate and how to get people like you involved in the fight. Somebody want to answer that? So why are we here tonight? Why am I here talking to you right now? As Randy said, there'll be some Chicken Little the sky is falling in tonight's message, but it's for real. So in preparation to take the soda story and tell you more about what's going on, rather than just tell you about South Carolina's story, it's important for me to let you know what's about to happen to your coast. So we'll start with a brief history of drilling in North Carolina offshore. During World War II, a lot of our military was strapped for being able to get oil to be able to, and diesel and so forth, to be able to fuel ships and maintain our military. So as early as 1946, they couldn't do this during the war, but as soon as they could after the war, Esso, which was the precursor to Exxon, drilled a well, the first well in the offshore of North Carolina, about 1,200 yards from the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse, where it used to be. So as early as 1946, they were exploring for oil and gas right off your coast, right there. That well turned out to be a dry hole, which is good for everybody. So nothing happened for quite some time until you'll recall in 1973 was the first Arab oil embargo. And y'all recall what that was like, sitting in line at the gas station trying to get, well, okay, there are a lot of young people here who weren't even born then, but for those of us who were here then, it was a huge wake-up call for America that we were importing oil from countries that we couldn't rely on. So there was a big push for offshore oil and gas development in the US. So from 1976 to 1982, there were 51 wells drilled in the Atlantic. Most of them were drilled north of Virginia. There were 9 wells drilled off the coast of Georgia. And one of those wells was drilled right there. Sorry, those were the 51, the closest ones that came to North Carolina. And then the one that was drilled actually in North Carolina waters right here was Shale well BR 93, number 1. And again, fortunately, that Shale well was a dry hole, as were most of the 51 wells. So once again, the Atlantic was saved. There were not, at that time, commercial reserves to be had by the oil and gas companies. There's an interesting story that went with that Shale well, and maybe some of the people here were concerned about that well. Back in 1984, when they were drilling it, 2 hurricanes blew through, Diana and Josephine, made drilling that well really precarious and terribly expensive, which also, thank you Mother Nature, kind of kept the oil and gas companies at bay for a while. Then we had an area off the coast here, interestingly called the Manio Prospect. It's that area right there with that yellow chevron. There were leases granted to Exxon and Mobil in those years. I'll take it, here's a little bigger picture to look at. These areas were leased by the federal government off Cape Hatteras. There were 2 wells that were going to be drilled, that were permitted to be drilled. One was owned by Chevron and Partners. The other was owned by Mobil and Partners. The Chevron well was approved, but not drilled. And the Mobil well ended up in the courts. Maybe some of you were involved in fighting that fight. And the court battle lasted 10 years. Finally, what happened was the courts basically said, here, Mobil and Partners, you can have your money back because we're not going to allow drilling in the Atlantic, because of some presidential and congressional moratoria that started taking place. So as the Atlantic looked like it was going to get developed, we were fortunate to have George H.W. Bush first, and then Bill Clinton issue moratoria that kept our Atlantic coast safe. So until 2008, things were pretty good. And then the first program was set up for the Atlantic again, off the coast of Virginia. At that time, the only state that was interested in pursuing drilling was Virginia. And that was a well that was proposed to be drilled in 2011. Does anybody know what happened on April 20th, 2010? the BP Deepwater Horizon, right? So the catastrophe in the Gulf. So because of that catastrophe in 2010, all potential drilling was shut down again in the Atlantic. President Obama, again, declared a moratorium. So that well off Virginia was never drilled. Lucky, 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 lucky. We have been, again, in our Atlantic has been in the hopes and dreams of the oil and gas industry since that last moratorium in 2010. So, I want you to pay attention to where this area is located. It's approximately 45 miles off the coast. It's in about 5,000 feet of water. The Deepwater Horizon was located similarly in the Gulf of Mexico, 45 miles off the coast of Louisiana and 5,000 feet of water. That's important because I'm going to show you that the interest that lies now for the oil and gas companies in the Atlantic is in deepwater drilling. So let's look a little bit ahead here. Back into the historical sequence, we fought this fight. Many of you were involved in this fight on the last proposed program, which was 2017 to 2022. That was under the Obama administration. We were actually earmarked for a lease sale for 2021 in that program. But finally, in March of 2016, we were all out on the beach celebrating because President Obama pulled the Atlantic. Again, in that point, it was the coast of Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia, pulled that area from the program. So all that was left in that drilling program for 2017 to 2022 was the Gulf of Mexico. Yay, we got lucky again. It was not without a lot of hard work, I have to say. I mean, this luck is the result of a lot of people working hard to make it happen. So we thought we were done. March of 2016, things looked pretty good. And then President Trump got elected. And while we were able to remove the lease sale from the Obama administration's hold, we still had the threat of seismic testing. It wasn't until 2 weeks before President Obama left office that he canceled the seismic permits. Then January 21st of 2017, President Trump took office, and one of his first actions, April 28th of 2017, was to accelerate the offshore drilling and permitting process. Normally this happens every 5 years. Because we had gotten out of the 2017 to 2022 process, it shouldn't have started again until 2022. But he decided by executive order, here he is signing the executive order, to accelerate the process. Oh, you know what? Should we turn out that light? It just dawned on me. If that helps anyway. So that 2017 to 2022 program was put on the shelf, but a brand new program was being started, the 2019 to 2024 program, and he started that by executive order. Now, why are these people smiling? Well, this person, who you may know, Lisa Murkowski, is from Alaska, has had a history of oil and gas drilling, so she's very excited there's going to be more drilling in Alaska. This gentleman, you may or may not be able to see, he's Steve Scalise. He was the congressman who was hit by the bullet in the baseball game. Where is Steve Scalise from? Louisiana. So he was pretty happy about the fact that this program was going to be accelerated. This gentleman is from South Louisiana. This gentleman's from South Louisiana. This gentleman, my friends in South Carolina were pretty upset to see there because he's a congressman from the upstate of South Carolina, Congressman Jeff Duncan. So, how interesting. Our coast is being put at risk along with the coast that you would expect, Alaska and so forth. And then Randy tells me that y'all might recognize that hairline. It didn't mean anything to me. Does anybody know who this is? David.
That would be my congressman, David Rouser, from the North Carolina 7th Congressional District, just south of you folks here.
So a big part of the North Carolina coast of the North Carolina coast, not one of your upstate congressmen, but the North Carolina coast congressional representative right there, David Rouser. So that gives you a sense of how excited people were about the president opening up. What he ultimately did was open up 98% of the US coast for the potential for offshore drilling. He wasn't content with the last fight that we fought, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia. He said, no, all of the US is up for grabs, as well as Alaska. I just didn't have enough room to put the picture here. Well, before we do that, let me say that what's really interesting to note about this, I know you can't read any of the numbers, but this is color-coded by the amount of reserves that are expected to be available off the coast. So down in the Gulf of Mexico, where there's been a 50-year history of drilling, you can see they've found a lot of reserves. The color is the darkest it can be. And then you start seeing these orange colors. They're expecting a lot of oil and gas off the coast of the Gulf Coast of Florida, and then up here in the mid-Atlantic, and off Southern California, where there's been oil and gas drilling since the 70s. So, and then, less up in Oregon and Washington, and again, less down off South Carolina, Georgia, and the east coast of Florida. You all have a pretty dark color orange here. That's an important thing for you to keep in mind, because the Manio prospect was leased. There is data that supports the calculation that indicates there's probably oil and gas located in some significant amount off your coast. Part of the reason John and I are here is because the way the government draws the border, the offshore border between North and South Carolina. Even if South Carolina and Georgia are pulled out of this program and you all are still in the program, it's a shot right off our bow because that coastline that's drawn in there will come right down across South Carolina's geographic border. So that's why we're here. So anyway, the essence was this, this new program. Trump said he wants to accelerate the work that is done by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, and to initiate, as I said, this new program for 2019 to 2024, as well as accelerate the seismic permitting applications for the Atlantic. So while all of that had been put away, not only was it back in an accelerated form. So we're going to talk about two things this evening: seismic airgun survey permits and drilling leases, which are two separate processes in the government. They're not done in the same time, in the same way. They're done through different processes. So you have to really understand when you're fighting this fight that you're fighting two distinct issues. First, this is the process by which seismic permits are issued. You can see there's a lot that goes on in the government to get to this point. And this very seminal decision happened November 30th of 2018. This is when things called the IHAs were issued by the National Marine Fisheries Service, part of NOAA, that said, yeah, it's going to be all right for the seismic companies to cause damage to harm marine life in order to get their seismic done. There is only, while there's a lot here, there's really only one step between the IHAs being issued and the permits for seismic, and that is BOEM does a final review. So we are literally, this is the Chicken Little part, we're literally a piece of paper away from issuing seismic. Now, some of you may know that there, again, thanks to South Carolina's Attorney General, Alan Wilson, North Carolina's Attorney General, and a group of environmental groups and a lot of municipalities, there is a fight right now to just have an injunction on those permits, just to hold those permits until this can be heard in the courts, because without that, the seismic companies could be permitted and allowed to move forward in doing their testing, even though there are lawsuits in place suing it. So we're waiting to hear. The district court is in Charleston. Judge Gergel is presiding, and we're waiting to hear whether or not we'll at least get a delay on the seismic permits. It could happen this summer. They could start seismic this summer. This is how immediate this is. So I think most of you know what seismic airgun surveys are. I'm just going to quickly remind you that this is a process by which a seismic vessel sets off extremely loud sounds via an air blast. The sound is so powerful that it can reach down 4 miles into the earth. What it does is the signal bounces off of the different geological layers in the subsea and comes back up to a receiver. That data is interpreted by geophysicists to translate into a map that shows what the subsea looks like. It does not find oil and gas. Seismic does not find oil and gas. It finds geologic structures that may or may not contain oil and gas. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Of course, unfortunately, in the process, it causes tremendous harm to marine life. So it's the first step before exploratory drilling. The air guns are detonated every 10 to 12 seconds, as you probably all know, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for months. There is, being now in the permit process, up to a year's worth of seismic that will be going on. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Imagine the smoke alarm in your house going off every 10 seconds, 24 hours, 7 days a week, and you can't leave the noise. Because the noise, we know, travels at least 2,400 miles or 2,000 miles or 2,500 miles or some significant number of miles. That distance is from here to Las Vegas. So imagine waking up in the middle of the night with your smoke alarm going off and trying to escape that noise and having to get you and your family and your dogs and your cats and your goldfish to Las Vegas so that you wouldn't hear it. That's the power of that noise. So the noise, we know, impairs every type of function of marine mammals because they rely on sound in the ocean to be able to do things like find each other, to mate, to find their calves, to be able to feed, to communicate with each other, and to migrate. So this is terrible, terrible damage that's going to be done to our ocean life. The recent research also shows that the impact translates down through fishes down to zooplankton. So the very basis of our food chain is harmed by seismic airgun surveys. You know, I grew up in the science community. I really believe data is important, but it's not worth this risk, right? It's not worth this risk. First, do no harm. So this is what's been permitted so far. Those 5 IHAs that I mentioned, incidental harassment authorizations, I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means, have been issued to 5 companies. So the 5 companies here with the arrows, this area is the area that's going to be potentially permitted by BOEM. I want you also to notice on this chart, there's one area here, right off the North Carolina coast. What's out here? The Manio prospect. That area has not yet been, they have not yet asked for a permit because they want a 3D permit, and I'll tell you in a minute the difference between these 2D permits that they're granting and a 3D permit, but that is a huge red flag. That not only do they want to know what the geologic structure looks like off the entire mid and South Atlantic, they also especially want to know what that area off the North Carolina coast looks like. So, again, the amount of noise, every 10 seconds, 24 hours a day, they have to be completed within a year. Thank you for moving your head. We will never get this data, right? Well, we can get the data if we wait 25 years, but by then it'll be too late for us citizens to be able to have a comment on that. The results of this information, this is proprietary to the seismic companies, to the oil and gas companies, and to BOEM, who uses the information to do their own calculation of what they think the oil and gas reserves are off our coast. So only oil companies and BOEM receive the results, and all that harm is done. Let me tell you, so that's 87,000 miles of seismic that's been requested. Let me give you a little bit of a sense of what 87,000 miles of seismic lines look like. How many miles is it from New York to LA, roughly? 3,000 miles. So 87,000 miles is how many trips back and forth across the country? Do the math. Close to 30, right? 30 times back and forth across our country. The good people at BOEM took those 5 permits, and in each permit, they lay out the seismic lines that they are going to run. That's 87,000 miles of permits. Notice how intense, imagine how intense the noise is. A ship moving at 6 knots, setting off a seismic blast every 10 to 12 seconds for months at a time, day and night. I want you also to notice that there is an image that occurs in here. You see that image? What do you think that is?
High density.
It's high density. What does it translate to? Here's a clue. The Outer Continental Shelf. Why are they interested in the Outer Continental Shelf? Because they drilled 51 wells in shallow water back in the 70s and 80s, when that was really about all we could do, drill up to about 1,000 feet of water. Now, we're capable of drilling into 11,000 feet through 11,000 feet of water column. So we can use drill ships out and drill along that slope. Got it? Along that slope. So that's called deepwater drilling. Any time you're drilling in water deeper than roughly 1,000 feet is considered deepwater drilling. Again, Deepwater Horizon, 50 miles off the coast, 5,000 feet of water. That's where it happened in that same geologic type situation in the Gulf of Mexico. All right, if that didn't scare you enough, this is an analysis that's done by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management that shows the various oil and gas plays that they predict are there based on all the logging and wells that were drilled back in the dark ages. And this has been updated pretty regularly. The most recent geologic update and petroleum engineering work was done in 2016. So this is very recent. Not only do they identify where those possible oil and gas areas are, but then they went back and they put a probability of finding commercial reserves in those areas. And there is the #1 greatest probability of finding oil and gas reserves. And where is that? The Manio prospect. So, bullseye, your coast, right there. South Carolina, not so much. Georgia, even less. So of all of the areas, if you were an oil and gas company, of all the areas you would be most interested, well, we know that they're interested in the area where they want to run seismic, and we know that they want to run 3D seismic in this area, and we know that this area has been mapped based on old geologic data and a correlation that they do with the west coast of Africa, where they've been finding oil and gas. And this is the 3D application, the 3D seismic application on top of the bathymetry, so you can see what that looks like right there off the coast. If y'all don't feel like you're wearing a bullseye, I hope you do. I mean, if you didn't walking in here tonight, know that you're wearing a bullseye. I hope you do now. Because there's such confidence that they will find oil and gas there that they wouldn't even need to run the seismic. I mean, it's riskier. Oil and gas companies love to have that data before they punch a hole, but they've got enough information there that they could go ahead and drill. They were willing to drill with a lot less information in 1984. So, these IHAs have been issued. Let me just tell you a little bit more about them, and then we'll go into some of the status of the drilling leasing. So as I mentioned, November 30th, the IHAs, the incidental hazard harassment authorizations were issued. All 5 companies have been given the permission by NOAA, by the National Marine Fisheries Service, to take, what's called take, marine life. The focus is on whales, dolphins, and sea turtles because they're protected under the MMPA, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. A take basically means that you're going to injure, harass, or potentially kill an animal. So there are two kinds of takes. There's a level A harassment and a level B harassment. A level A harassment is you are definitely going to injure a mammal. A level B harassment is that, you will potentially disturb or disrupt a mammal's behavioral patterns, which we talked about before: migration, breathing, nursing, feeding, sheltering. You can imagine with years worth of seismic going on, if you were a whale, that that level B harassment could be costing you your life. So this is what the National Marine Fisheries Service issues. They take all the species that are off our coast, and they say, okay, for each of the 5 seismic companies, each company is allowed this number of level A harassments and this number of level B harassments. So if you add up all the harassments for all the species, there are 49 whales that are okay to injure and 20 dolphins, but the disrupting of behavior is huge, right? 60,000 whales, 316,000 dolphins. Let's just take it to sea turtles. Any of you here are sea turtle people? Yeah, same with us. We walk our beach every Friday morning looking for sea turtle nests. Well, the big turtles, not that big, but turtles bigger than a foot in diameter, they're allowed to impair the hearing of 44,000 of those, harass at a behavioral level 210,000, again, if you add up all the numbers for the turtles. And the little turtles that we fight so hard to make sure that each and every one gets out of the nest okay, 500,000 can be harassed. That's what our government provides to seismic companies, that level of harm. Before I go on, how many of you know about North Atlantic right whales? How many North Atlantic right whales are in existence, approximately? 500-ish, between 400 and 500. How many are breeding females? About 100. So there, of that one species, about 100 breeding female North Atlantic right whales are left. Who knows? Who knows which of those whales will be injured? And you all have had beached whales up here lately, so this is all very real to you, I know. Anyway, the conclusion of the National Marine Fisheries Service was basically, I'll just give you the punchline. When mitigation happens, they think because this is happening over a very large area, 330,000 square miles, and it's going to take place in a comparatively short duration, less than 1 year, they say that's a comparatively short duration, the potential impacts are both temporary and relatively minor. Therefore, National Marine Fisheries Service does not expect aggregate impacts from the 5 surveys to marine mammals to affect their ability to live, either alone from the seismic or in combination with other activities going on in the ocean. It's called a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact. So that's where that permit stands. If you can't read the punchline on this, this oil man says, oh, it must have been something she ate, is why that whale ended up on the beach. Okay, so there's a ton of research on this. I'm not going to go into that. That's Oceana's expertise. We have lots of information available to you about the research. A lot of it's been done at Duke, and y'all should be very proud of the work that's been done here, particularly Dr. Novacek, who has testified before Congress about the extent of the noise and the impact on marine life. And in my bailiwick, it's important to understand, as I said before, seismic doesn't tell you where there's oil and gas. It tells you where there are geologic structures that may or may not contain oil and gas. If you run 2D seismic, this is the first seismic that they want to run. When you run 2D seismic, you get a survey that looks like this. Geologists go off with that and they make maps of the subsea and they pick places where they think there might be oil and gas. 2D seismic alone is only accurate 15 to 25% of the time. They can only find oil and gas 15 to 25% of the time if they only run 2D. So then what they'll do is go back and ask, hey, can we do this again? We want to run 3D seismic over areas that look particularly interesting to us. So they'll run 3D seismic and they'll get an image that looks like this. Oh, well, that looks a little bit more interesting. Maybe that's an oil and gas trap. And that might be where we want to drill. But even with 3D seismic, they've run that seismic twice now, there's only a 40% chance of finding oil and or gas. So the only way you find oil and gas is to drill. That's the punchline. Seismic is a great way to narrow the realm of possibility, but it doesn't find oil and gas. The only way you find it is to drill. And if anybody tells you anything to the contrary, you send them to me. If this weren't so, in 2015, Shell wouldn't have spent $7 billion drilling a dry hole in the Arctic. It's a risk that oil companies calculate and they take knowingly, and sometimes they're wrong. So, enough about seismic, let's talk about drilling. So the second process that is coming up for our next level of review is called the drilling leasing process. Many of you last year were told about this program, and you wrote letters or signed petitions during a comment period that happened last spring. And maybe you went to Raleigh to talk to BOEM when they came to North Carolina. And for those of you who sent in comments, thank you. There were 2 million comments submitted about this program. That's a huge number. That's a huge number of citizens who took the time to let the government know what they think of this. So all of those comments have gone back, and a lot of information has been collected in terms of an environmental impact statement, and BOEM has been working on this for the last number of months. We were supposed to hear before the end of the year which parts of the Outer Continental Shelf were going to be up for grabs. You'll then recall Secretary Zink resigned, the Secretary of Interior. He was having a little bit of trouble, so he resigned, and just today was Acting Secretary Bernhardt's Senate hearing. So Acting Secretary Bernhardt, a previous lobbyist for the oil and gas industry, is going to become the Secretary of Interior, who's in charge of this process. He said today, don't worry, we will winnow down that list of 98% of the US coast, but he didn't give any indication of what's going to be in or out. We don't know when that information's coming. There was somebody from BOEM who just 2 weeks ago said it should happen in the second quarter of this year, so from April 1st on, we could be hearing this next round. And then here's all we have left. We have a 90-day comment period. We have 90 days to stop it. You get one more shot at writing to the government of telling all your elected officials that you don't want this off our coast, and then that final program is written. Whoever is in or out happens in that time frame. They plan to have that final program done by the end of this year, because in the program there are lease sales for the Atlantic in 2020. That would be next year. So seismic this year is their goal. Drilling next year is the intention. Again, as I mentioned, even if they don't get the seismic done, Manio is a very real possibility. High probability. Got it. So this is the last that the U.S. citizenry gets to talk about what happens in our collective ownership of the federal waters that are being considered in this program. So one way to think of it is each of us owns 350 millionth of our offshore waters. So you have a responsibility to say what you want to have happen there. Because once that program is finished, it goes to the President and Congress. They have a chance to comment on it. It has never been stopped in the past by the President or Congress, so it's a possibility, but it's highly unlikely that once the program gets to the final draft, it'll be put in place. And as I said, in the program, the first lease sale is 2020. All of the rest of this is permitting that goes on between the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the oil and gas companies to hold the lease sale so that the oil and gas companies can bid on the leases they want, and then to begin exploration drilling, and then do delineation drilling and first oil and gas production. This is a rough timeline of how things can unfold. Exploration drilling could take place easily 5 to 8 years after those leases are received. Production could begin as early as 2028. This is real. This isn't imaginary. These are real numbers. This is all backed in BOEM's work. People I know who have worked for BOEM in the past have validated this. The sky is falling. But when you're talking to people about why you don't want drilling, there's a lot you can say about why we don't need drilling, because they will tell you reasons why they think we need drilling and why we need those reserves to be produced by 2028. The first reason we don't need drilling in the in the Atlantic, is the United States doesn't need it. We don't need it. It's not 1973 anymore. A lot has happened, and I'll tell you about that. The second, it's really bad for our coastal economy, for the tourism, for the livelihood, for this business, for all the businesses along the coast. The third is it's a forever decision, and this is something people will never tell you about, but I'm going to explain to you. It's a decision that's made by the feds. They sell off our precious reserves, and they're going to be exported to foreign countries, and I'll tell you why that's the truth. The profits, of course, go to the oil and gas industry. The harm comes to us, to our coast, to our health, and to our economy. They get all the benefits, and we take all the risk. So, why the U.S. doesn't need oil and gas? Has anybody ever heard of hydraulic fracturing or fracking? Right. So, in the last 8 to 10 years, all the smart engineers that I grew up with are now, senior muckety-mucks in oil and gas companies, and the technology has evolved from where we used to be able to drill either vertically or directionally with some angle. They can now drill with a 90-degree angle. It's called horizontal drilling. And when they drill 90 degrees and they fracture the formation that they drill through, they're able to produce the entire formation at once, rather than just produce a little bit of it and then have to go drill another well and produce a little of it and drill another well. So hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling has created something called the Shale Revolution. So they're going back into a lot of old reservoirs, places where, as an intern in college, I worked. And they are using horizontal drilling all around the United States to dramatically increase our oil and gas supply. I'm going to tell you, just to give you a clue how big a deal this is, about one little place down here called the Permian Basin. Have anybody ever heard of the Permian Basin? West Texas and the corner in New Mexico. They just finished an analysis of the anticipated oil and gas reserves available in the Permian Basin, 26 billion barrels of oil and 281 trillion cubic feet of gas. Let's compare that number, just to put it in perspective, with the entire amount of oil and gas expected to be found in the Atlantic. Right? The expected amount of oil and gas to be found in the entire Atlantic in deep water, 1/10 of the Permian Basin. So we don't need to tap into the Atlantic. We have more oil and gas coming from our onshore development than we ever need to tap into offshore. Just to give you a little history and what that looked like, so this scale is from 1970 to 2017 on both. This is U.S. crude oil production, U.S. natural gas production, essentially marketed gas. So you can see we had a real problem with decline. Here's the 1970. This is the Arab oil embargo, right? And this is the decline of the oil and gas that we were producing in the country down to when the Shale Revolution began, and we turned around, and we actually are producing about up here now about 14 million barrels a day. In natural gas, we've had a pretty constant growth in natural gas production, but it's off the charts now. And it's not just a one-time thing. If we didn't sell all of our oil and gas to other countries, we would have a pretty significant supply of U.S. crude oil and natural gas to carry us easily into the 2040s. with what we already have known, with what is already identified and commercially available. This is our import. I think this is an interesting curve. This is U.S. imports of crude over time. And you see we started importing after the war. That was the Arab oil embargo, right? And then we were up to 14 million barrels a day of imports. And then again, when the Shale Revolution kicked in, we didn't need to import anymore. So it's not only that we're not importing anymore, we are a net energy exporter. We're a net oil and a net natural gas exporter. In fact, we're exporting so much oil and gas that we have a bottleneck of gas to be exported down in the Gulf of Mexico. So they are building liquefied natural gas terminals as quickly as they can permit them. FERC is the agency in the government that permits LNG terminals, liquefied natural gas. So they take the gas, they make it a liquid, they put it on a ship, and they send it overseas. On the East Coast here, just to give you a sense of it, Cove Point, Maryland was an import facility in the past. It was converted to an export facility. It has a first 20-year supply to go out of Cove Point has already been contracted to China and India. So that's U.S. natural gas that's going to those two countries already under contract. Elba Island, which is in the Savannah River, again, was a net import facility. Now it's an export facility. They're putting it on stream. They've already started this first quarter of 2019. Elba Island, another 20 years worth of contracted natural gas going overseas. So the Energy Information Agency projects that U.S. LNG export capacity will reach 9 billion cubic feet a day by the end of 2019, making it the third largest exporter. We're the largest producer, the third largest exporter behind Australia and Qatar. I don't know if I could even explain to you how mind-blowing this is. When I was a student, during the Arab oil embargo, we projected that we had 40 years of oil and gas left in the country. We were expecting to be using renewables almost exclusively by this point in our life. Jimmy Carter had solar panels on the White House, for those of you who remember back in the 70s. We were making the move. But when the technology allowed for all these supplies to be developed in our country, we passed laws. The crude oil export, we weren't allowed to export crude oil from the 1970s to 2015. Congress just passed the export permit law in December of 2015. And now it's great. We've got a ton of oil and gas, and we're shipping it all overseas. So that's the first reason. We've got more oil and gas than we could use, and certainly plenty to be able to make the transition. If the oil and gas companies wouldn't be selling it off to foreign countries. I just have to say one more thing about this. FERC, the agency that permits these LNG terminals, has just increased the starting salary for engineers to go to work for FERC, so they will have more engineers on staff to review the permits and to open more LNG facilities. Let me bring it real close to home again. I think it was 2 or 3 days ago, Lynn Good, who is the CEO of Duke Energy, was just commenting on the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. You probably may know in your upstate there's a lot of concern about the Atlantic Coast pipeline coming up through the northern parts of our states. What we really are concerned about is that they'll bring the Atlantic Coast Pipeline to the coast. They'll bring a pipeline to the coast, build an LNG terminal, ship the gas that's coming out of the Marcellus. This is West Virginia, Pennsylvania, that gas that's available up there. Put it in another LNG terminal and send it overseas. The only constraint on oil and gas companies making money right now is that there aren't enough LNG export facilities. So FERC is hiring more people to be able to permit these LNG facilities.
Can I add a little on that?
Sure, go ahead.
Originally, after 1973, the United States would not allow oil exports.
Right.
They changed the law. The date they changed the law, the price of a barrel was $20 a barrel. 60 days later, the price of a barrel was $60. All of our gas right now should be about $1 cheaper. It isn't because the oil companies are not keeping storage capacity here to keep prices low, and
Right.
they're shipping it off and selling it at big bucks.
Yeah, that's a really important
Thank you,
point.
Congress.
That's exactly right. Our natural gas price is derived from our oil price. So what you put in your car, your gasoline that goes in your car is derived from oil. The oil, of course, would be selling at a much lower price if we had it contained in our nation. But by being able to put it into the open market at a higher price, that raises our our gasoline prices. So thank you. That's very accurate and another very important point. Okay, the second reason, and this is South Carolina's data. Y'all probably have North Carolina's data. I don't have it available, but we know at least as far back as 2008 in South Carolina that the American Petroleum Institute was lobbying in Columbia, in our state capital, for to bring jobs and money to South Carolina. And a lot of our elected representatives got very excited about that because they heard that South Carolina was going to get $3.9 billion in revenue from oil and gas. $3.9 billion. That sounds like a heck of a lot of money. If you're in Columbia and you got a lot of poor people in South Carolina, it's like, wow, 35,000 jobs, 3.9 billion barrels, $3.9 billion in revenue. That's pretty darn exciting. But we just mapped the tourism revenue that comes from the 4 coastal counties in South Carolina, which currently is about $15 billion on a very conservative 4% growth rate. The difference between the hypothetical revenues that would come from oil and gas versus our known revenue that comes from tourism is 27-1. That's a pretty crazy business decision to take something that's going to put at risk that kind of revenue. Not to mention the health impacts, the environmental impacts, and so forth. Okay. And then the third point, and as I mentioned, most people don't talk about this, and your elected representatives need to understand this more than anything else. When an oil and gas company gets a lease from the U.S. government, that lease entitles them to drill in that lease. Initially, they have to drill within 10 years. And then as long as they find and produce oil or gas, or both, from that lease, they're allowed to produce from that lease forever. And they're allowed to sell that lease to another company. So let me tell you a story about California. So many of you, well, okay, again, some of you, some of us were alive in 1969. There's been drilling off the coast of California at the end of a pier since 1897. But the United States offshore development, again because of the Arab oil embargoes, really got going off the coast of California in the 1960s and then in big way in the 70s. So there was this huge push on drilling offshore in Southern California, around Santa Barbara, Catalina Island. And the first huge Santa Barbara spill happened in 1969. Who remembers the 1969 spill, right? Huge. It actually was, in many ways, the start of the environmental movement in the country. When people saw what unregulated or poorly regulated industry could do to our coast, and because it happened to be in Santa Barbara, where very wealthy people live, it got a lot of attention. From 1969, the good people of Southern California tried to stop the U.S. government from leasing off the California coast. It took them from 1969 to 1982 to get the government to stop new leases. They kept having lease sales off the coast of California because the federal government's saying, hey, you don't have any authority out here in federal waters. So they kept leasing until finally in 1982, the government decided, okay, we're not going to issue any new leases. But those leases that were leased in the 60s were still producing, and oil and gas companies are allowed to continue to drill on those leases. So those were new wells being drilled on those old leases. So still today, after 50 years, we've got 26 platforms still producing oil and gas off the coast of California. Most of the wells and platforms are not owned by the major oil and gas companies that originally got those leases. They're owned by small independents, mom and pops, if you will. The reason mom and pops can continue to produce oil and gas from an old lease when a major can't is they don't put money into maintenance and taking care of the assets that they've acquired. So what happened as recently as May 20th, 2015, Memorial Day weekend, there was another spill on the coast of Southern California. Do y'all recall this problem? Okay, so what happened, here's three of the platforms off the coast of California, Heritage, Harmony, and Hondo. Again, being run by smaller companies with old pipelines that come to coast. They get the oil and gas is separated in this plant, and then these pipelines go along the coast. Well, there was a leak, a rupture in a pipeline right here at Refugio State Park. One state park and another state park right here. And this whole coast was oiled as a result of that leak. And the company went bankrupt that was responsible for the spill. Similarly, just a few months after that, some of the gas that's produced offshore is stored in underground canyons, underground storage. In an area called Aliso Canyon, there was a methane leak from one of these underground storage areas. There was a subdivision that had been built on top of that canyon. And when that leak occurred in October 2015, 109,000 metric tons released. It took months to stop it. 8,000 families had to be relocated because of the health hazard associated with the methane leak. So it's a forever decision. It's not like, oh shucks, we didn't get it right this time, they're going to lease off our coast. It's like, oh shucks. If they start selling leases off of our coast, we will be like Southern California and having to try to stop this once Pandora's box has been opened. This is a serious, I can't stress how serious this is. So let's just recap. Manio, high probability of oil and gas, old seismic, be nice to have the new seismic, but don't have to have it. They even want to do 3D seismic. If they lease that area, if North Carolina isn't pulled and they lease that area, this is not something that's just going to like go away. These oil and gas wells tend to produce 40 to 50 years if the reserves are there. So all is not lost. There is some good news. There are some wonderful people in the room here, some elected officials who get what this is all about. Your governor, your attorney general, 3 of your congressmen, and all of your coastal municipalities, except for 3, have issued resolutions opposing offshore drilling and seismic surveys. Randy, I don't know if you want to tell me, come up and do the identification thing.
Right. This is just a snapshot. That this is not enough room in this slide to get it all in, but if you'll look to the far left here, and the reason we have this gentleman here is because does everyone know who this man is? This is Walter Jones. He's recently passed away, and coastal North Carolina and this nation as a whole has lost a true gentleman and a fighter for our ocean out here too. So I wanted to put him there. Of course, this gentleman is, if I can find that button again, he's in the room with us again. This is, of course, Bob Woodard. And then we have Ben Cahoon, the mayor of the fine city we're in right now. We have the Attorney General Stein here. This young lady is Pricey Harrison. She's actually a North Carolina House member from Greensboro, North Carolina. We have the governor here. We have, does any, oh, there I go again. Give a man something like this and he'll just destroy it. Okay, here we have a gentleman that is Rhett Newton, the mayor of Beaufort, North Carolina, another hero. We have here Harper Peterson. He's the newly elected state senator from down in Wilmington, North Carolina. Beside him, another champion, Deb Butler, House of representative from down in New Hanover and Brunswick counties. Now, there are some things these individuals don't have in common, and then there are things they do have in common. But let's talk about the two states. Let's talk about the state that Peg and John come from, South Carolina. You go into South Carolina, this issue is not a partisan issue. It's not bipartisan, it is nonpartisan. You go down there and you don't go down political lines and there's a wall there. Not at all. You can go in local elected offices in North Carolina, up and down the coast, with the exception of 2 or 3 municipalities there that have not got on board. But something, again, that they don't have in common are their politics. You're looking at, and even in North Carolina, in the coastal region, you're probably looking at 80% or more are Republican elected officials, local electeds in counties and in cities, towns, up and down the North Carolina coast. But then we have a problem. But things seem to be changing a little bit. Does anyone know this gentleman?
Bobby Haney.
It's Bobby Haney.
House of Representatives.
He is, like Bob said, your local member of the House of Representatives. Bobby Haney has broken the glass ceiling in Raleigh in the state legislature. Up until a week ago, there had never been a Republican House or Senate member to sign on to a letter in opposition to offshore oil. This gentleman not only has signed on to this, he has presented this to all of his colleagues in Raleigh, asking them to stand with coastal North Carolina. What you need to do is call this man and thank him. And thank him for his continued support on this issue. And you might give your state senator a call and ask him to join Bobby. Bobby needs some help. And if you know state representatives across the state, reach out to them and let's get Bobby some help and let's let this fire spread along House and Senate members. And but anyway, I just wanted to give a quick thing here. Again, all these are coastal heroes, and there are others, but you're in good company with these folks. Thanks, Peg.
Sure. Thank you. Okay, so 42 municipalities, solid coastal support for this issue. Not only do you need to continue to work, as Randy says, with the legislators in the state and your folks in Washington, but you also need to talk to the folks across the state. This is what our congressman, our former congressman Mark Sanford said to me when we were in Washington once lobbying there. Mark is a Republican, and he was our biggest proponent or our biggest supporter and biggest opponent to offshore oil and gas drilling in Congress. And Mark said, and this is what you need to tell people, the coast is where our memories are made. This is where we bring our families. This is where we spend our vacations. This is where we raise our kids. This is where the heart of our families lives, is the coast, our vacations. When you take that message to people in the upstate, they will come support the coast. They know how important this place is to them individually for generations. So it's not just a coastal issue, it belongs to everybody in the state. Again, a lot of opposition from fishing groups, from business groups, and I love that in North Carolina you've got the Council of Churches, Interfaith Power and Light. You've really got a broad group of folks who are working this issue. And now it's time for you to do something, okay? So it's your turn to help protect the coast, or to continue to help protecting the coast. Our marine life is saying, I think they're trying to send us a message about seismic testing. There are lots of ways to take action, even at this point when we don't have when we're waiting on those decisions. First of all, thank the governor and thank the Attorney General for the stand that they've taken. The voice of the governor is really important in the federal process. Governors are listened to in a big way when it relates to what happens off their coast. Also, make sure your senators, who are currently for offshore oil and gas drilling, understand how you feel about this issue. So call and write them. If you've never reached out to an elected official before, it's not tough. You call them and you say, my name is, and I live blank, and I am your constituent. Those are the 4 most powerful words in the American lexicon. I am your constituent. That's how a democracy works. And you let them know that you oppose seismic, you oppose drilling, and that you need their support now. We cannot have them diddle around any longer. Similarly, contact the folks who represent you in the State House, in the State Assembly. If you don't know who your state representative and senator are, go look them up, ncleg.gov. Same kind of thing. I am your constituent. I live in your district. And this is a really important message. You know, we're very excited when we drive from South Carolina up into North Carolina because you've got solar panels in places we wish we had them. You've got a ton of solar panels going on. Bravo to you. But it's really important that people understand that this is a critical juncture in moving away from fossil fuels toward renewables, which is the legacy that we need to live. Those of us who remember 1969 and remember 1973 and remember 1979 and 1982 and 1984, we owe it to the young people who weren't alive then to leave these resources where they belong, in the ground, off our coast, and continue to work with our state legislators to put renewable energy in place so we won't have this fight ad nauseum into the future. So we'd love to have you sign up for our newsletter, follow us on Facebook. There are Don't Drill North Carolina websites to follow as well, and Facebook pages. Stay in touch. We will let you know as more immediate action needs to happen, as the plan is released and the programs are coming out.
Thank y'all so very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you,
Randy.